Now, why are these people smiling about the $1.3 trillion spending package passed by the House today? Chuck Schumer, explain your joy.
This spending agreement brings the era of austerity to an unceremonious end. We Democrats are really happy with what we were able to accomplish on a number of priorities that Democrats have fought for all along.
Democrats are thrilled because they're about to secure runaway spending that was out of reach even under Obama. Discretionary spending is skyrocketing. No more budget caps for this gang. Meanwhile, Republicans are tripping all over themselves. Have you seen this? They're trying to justify this boondoggle. Now, I realize they're up against, as usual, government shutdown, but the largest military expenditure in 14 years and an explosion in discretionary spending is not going to pave the way to victory in November. And by the way, if you're going to increase military funding this much, how about even the pretense of trying to offset some of that with spending cuts? Once a fiscal hawk when he was in Congress, Budget Director Mick Mulvaney, he tried mightily today to sell this rotten piece of fish.
We've talked for the last, 3, 4, 5, 6 months about trying to get the president's priorities funded, and this omnibus bill does that. When we look at the bill, we have to weigh what we asked for and what we had to give away to give it. Is it perfect? No. Is it exactly what we asked for in the budget? No. Were we ever going to get that? No. That's not how the process works.
Oh, thanks for the tutorial. When the American people have given you both houses of Congress and the White House, it's what you all said you needed, it should be the way the process works, Director Mulvaney. The GOP just cannot get its act together. The most important thing that President promised, his #1 priority, was getting that border wall built. Did that get lost on the people in Congress? Did they not catch the hundreds of times he mentioned it and during the rallies? He asked Congress for $1.6 billion to build 74 miles of concrete wall. Well, this omnibus orgy of spending dedicates a puny $641 million to something called border reinforcements. But Speaker Paul Ryan says, don't worry about it.
We fund government 1 year at a time. That's how the budget process works.
Sure.
So we're going to fund the wall 1 year at a time, in this case, for the next 6 months. You need fences, you need cameras, you need electronic devices, you need these you need the aerial devices to be able to police it. In the mountainous areas, you can't build a wall over a mountain, so you need cameras and you need drones up there. So it's a border wall system. It's different kinds of wall based on different kinds of conditions on the ground, and that's what we fund.
Oh, my gosh, that is just Washington speak. Sensors, extra fencing, sensors. What are they going to use? iPhones? Drones? This is not what the president promised. He vowed to build a wall. It is not complicated. And now we have the biggest spending bill in history, and it sets aside $640 million to supposedly fund wall construction for 1 year. My friends, I hate to say this, but as I see it right now, tonight, the wall's never going to happen. Because as we've dug into this and really looked into this, this bill doesn't fund the wall at all. In fact, the bill only pays for construction, I can't even believe I'm saying this, of see-through fencing that Congress actually authorized, I remember this, back in 2006. The omnibus bill that we're talking about tonight funds 33 miles of new barriers and replacement fencing for 59 miles. But understand this. There is no wall construction. All told, you, the taxpayer, will refence part of the border for a grand total of, wait for it, 92 miles. You know what that looks like? It looks like this, 92 miles. See that little white spot? We should have made it pink. That little white spot, look how big the border is. Why bother at all? Why don't we just put the big bienvenidos welcome mat at the border, because it doesn't matter. If the Republicans lose the midterms, the Democrats will never fund this thing and will be reliant on Paul Ryan's sensors and a few drones and replacement fencing to protect America. I will repeat, this is not what the American people voted for. And you know what really gets me? It's an embarrassment to the president. He knew how to win this election, and the Republicans, the swamp, want to take it away from him. Last week, he was at the border inspecting wall prototypes when he said this.
Look at the fence, and it's a very powerful fence, not doing the trick because they cut holes in it, and then they're patching holes all the time. I'm just looking, you have hundreds of holes cut in and patched. So the fence is not strong enough. It's not the right idea. But for those people, if you don't have a wall system, we're not going to have a country.
Okay, I agree with him. It can't be fences that are repaired intermittently with holes in them. See, if you don't have a wall, you don't have a country. Today, there was a meeting of millennials at the White House. It was pretty cool. And it is great to hear their concerns on a variety of topics. But how about the concern that the government, in this type of omnibus spending bill, is mortgaging away their future? The money that's being spent and borrowed and printed. This is Congressman Dave Bratt.
Everyone's concerned about the kids, except they're not. We're putting all this on the kid's credit card. It's intergenerational theft of the first magnitude. It's immoral. It's unethical. And we have to make a change.
We are saddling the next generation with ever-growing debt. And for what? If we truly cared about the millennials, we would firstly keep them safe by immediately funding the border wall. Then we would find real cuts throughout the federal budget to offset these radical expenditures so they wouldn't be stuck with the bill long after that military hardware and that flimsy border fence we're buying have all rusted away. We can do better. We must do better, or Republicans do not deserve to be in the majority. And that's the angle. Joining us now for reaction is South Carolina Republican Congressman Ralph Norman, who joins us from Charlotte. And here in Washington is Richard Goodstein. He's smiling like the cat who ate the canary. He's an attorney, Democratic strategist friend. Great to see both of you. All right, Congressman, I got to start with you. You guys got the House, you got the Senate, and you got the White House. And now we have a spendorama, which I imagine Barack Obama must be watching this somewhere comfortably and thinking, man, I got to hand it to you guys. You guys can do it better than I can. You can spend that money better than I can. What's going on here, Congressman?
Well, Laura's unacceptable. What did you say, dead fish? That's what I think this spending bill is, the omnibus. You know, it's really an insult to get a 2,200-page document and get 16 hours to read it. If you do the math, I have to read 137 pages an hour and digest it. And now we're on a 2-week vacation? Really? The system is broken. We've gotten the 12 appropriations over back in September. And, you know, we've got to make a change, and I'm tired of it. And I, along with a lot of other members, I'm a member of the Freedom Caucus. We voted against the rule today. We're not elected to bankrupt this country. And as Congressman Bratt said, you know, we are saddling our children with debt. If you do the math, for every taxpayer, it's a little under $200,000.
It's stunning.
And that's sad.
It's stunning. And I got to play this. I got to play this soundbite for you guys. Nancy Pelosi, who also seemed very happy, she had an extra spring in her step today, said this. Let's watch.
It's interesting to see from the standpoint of regular order why the Republicans thought that would be a good idea. Well, I think one of the reasons they rushed it through, posting it last night, taking it to rules on the floor today, not honoring the 3-day rule, they didn't want their Republican colleagues to see just exactly what was in the bill.
Well, she's famously said you have to pass it to see what's in it. It's 2,000 plus pages. We stacked it up last night, guys. And no one's reading this bill, let's face it. You vote on it, you get the heck out of town. The Senate looks like it's going to vote on it tonight because they see what's the writings on the wall. Richard Goodstein, look, I'm embarrassed tonight as a Republican. And that might not sell on TV, and maybe other networks are going to do all sex all the time. Maybe they'll have higher ratings. But I find this to be really important. We do not have the money for this spending. Republicans campaigned on this. And Democrats, look, if I'm you, I'm like sitting back going, what do we have to do now?
Yeah.
Good stuff.
I feel your pain. Seriously. I know where you've been and where Sean and others have been on deficit spending. At least when Barack Obama was running up trillion-dollar deficits, we had the Great Recession to recover from. Everybody's boasting now about how great this economy is, and to run trillion-dollar deficits in the face of that really is not right. And you talked with Sean earlier about sticking to promises, whether it's the border wall or balancing the budget or bringing coal jobs back. Yeah, as you put it, Donald Trump knew how to win the election. With all due respect, he knew how to win the election by saying things that everybody who knew policy knew he couldn't deliver on.
No, I don't agree with you. You can build a wall. We can put a man on the moon. We can do all the innovation we've done in technology. I think America could solve pretty much any big problem ahead of it if it wants to. But in Washington, Richard, it's both Republicans and Democrats. I'm not letting Democrats off the hook because they're big spenders too. They just want to keep it all going because the lobbyists get paid, the lawyers get all the money. I'm a former lawyer. Believe me, it's nice to charge $700 an hour. But the American people demand real accountability. What bang are we getting for this buck here? Is it really going to make all those millennials safer and more prosperous and happier? Congressman, you can chime in here, but look, the Democrats didn't get everything they want, obviously. Republicans, no one's going to get everything they want. I'm not going to come here tonight saying the president was going to get everything. But it seems to me he has an opportunity, or had an opportunity, to go to the American people and say, I campaigned on this. I think this is critical for the future of the country. If the government has to shut down because both parties don't want to protect our country, that's really sad, but maybe we need to have a conversation about that. I think he had to do that.
Well, and you can't let this process continue with the threat of a shutdown. You know, I was perfectly willing to have a shutdown and sit up in Washington, D.C. for 6 months or as long as it takes to not have the giveaway programs that we've had. Now, the Democrats are a huge part of this. If you look at the vote today on the rule, which all the rule was is allowing the budget to be voted on. It barely passed 211 to 207, and 182 Democrats
voted. Of course, you needed the Democrats. They don't have enough Republicans, Congressman. They needed the Democrat votes. And of course the Democrats are going to support this. Why wouldn't they?
Congress has passed, and the president has just signed today, a spending bill that will keep the government open and funded through next September. Trace Gallagher has been following this story from the very beginning. He's got the latest. Hey, Trace.
Hey, Tucker, the big ticket items are, one, the military. $700 billion goes for defense spending, which is $61 billion higher than last year, and the biggest defense boost in 15 years, which is why, after threatening a veto, the president ended up signing the bill. Then there's $591 billion for domestic programs, including money for road building and water projects, along with NASA, the FBI, and the IRS, and $5 billion to battle opioid abuse, up from $2 billion last year. There's also $4 million for anti-harassment training for lawmakers and congressional aides. President Trump wanted $25 billion to build the border wall. He got $1.6 billion. There's $380 million to improve election security, and much to the dismay of conservatives, the bill also continues federal funding of Planned Parenthood. And if you missed it, GOP Senator Rand Paul was on a Twitter tear, tweeting things like the sheer size of the bill and that it funds, quote, $12 million for scholarships for Lebanon, $20 million for Middle East Partnership Initiative scholarship programs, $12 million in military funding for Vietnam, $3.5 million for nutrition assistance to Laos, $15 million in developmental assistance to China, and $10 million for women law enforcement officers in Afghanistan. And that, Tucker, is your budget roundup for this Friday. Tucker.
Thanks, Trace. President Trump criticized today's budget bill even as he signed it. The deal is suboptimal, he suggested. It's certainly expensive. The legislation will trigger a $1 trillion deficit or come very close to that. That's great news here in D.C., by the way. The Range Rover dealership outside Washington is probably packed even now at this hour as lobbyists and contractors reward themselves for a job well done. They just got a massive raise. It's party time in D.C. There's an awful lot of pork in this thing. Given the cost, you'd think at the very least the bill would fund the critical needs of our country. Does it do that? Not even close. The legislation signed today is pretty much the opposite of what America voted for in 2016. The bill actively restricts the hiring of additional ICE agents for immigration enforcement. It caps the number of illegals ICE can detain at any one time. Ostensibly, it allocates $1.6 billion for border security. You may have heard that. What you may not know is that that money is explicitly prohibited from being spent on any kind of border wall, the wall that voters asked for in the last election. Now, Republicans may have found extra wall money by, I don't know, cutting funds to those sanctuary cities that are actively undermining federal law. But they didn't do that. Sanctuary cities will continue to be subsidized just as they always have been. And so, by the way, will the abortion enthusiasts at Planned Parenthood. Republicans repeatedly promised to defund Planned Parenthood, remember? But they're not. They're awarding Planned Parenthood another $500 million in tax dollars. In other words, nothing's changed. It's just gotten a lot worse. The message to the rest of us could not be clearer. Congress does not care about the territorial integrity of the country it runs. The people in charge of both major parties are committed to making sure that we never have meaningful borders of any kind. Anyone who manages to get here will get a job, welfare, health care, education, forever. Meanwhile, middle America continues to die. Those are Congress's priorities. Though in fairness, the bill actually does pay for border security, just not here in America. Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia, they all get American tax dollars to deal with their immigration problems. And congratulations. Also included in the bill is a $10 million chunk to hire female law enforcement in Afghanistan. $10 million for disadvantaged students in Egypt, not Egypt, Maine, Egypt the country. $12 million to boost the military capacity of Vietnam. And how about China? Our greatest geopolitical and economic rival. Well, the bill gives the Chinese $15 million in development aid, some of which go to promoting yak herding in Tibet. And on top of all of that, Congress gave itself a pay raise, needless to say. We'd love to have a Republican member of Congress on to explain why exactly we're sending money to China, which is rapidly overtaking us economically. But somehow we can't find any money to secure American borders. And we asked more than a dozen members of Congress to come on the show tonight. They all refused. And of course, you can see why. But here's an idea. Any member of Congress who supports sending tax dollars to China ought to resign from Congress tonight and give up his pension. That's a betrayal of our country. If only we knew who put that in the bill. It's a secret, of course. Members of Congress may not protect you, but they definitely protect each other. We do know that Paul Ryan signed off on that. Of course he did. Well, we're told we need this bill because of national security. But how secure is a nation that has no borders? Well, about as secure as a political party that has no rationale for existing, that treats its own voters like dupes and fools, that ignores election results like they didn't happen. Parties like that don't last long, and they shouldn't.
In today with the latest on the budget. So the budget has passed in the Senate. The budget passed in the Senate by a vote of 65 to 32. It passed overwhelmingly in the House by 252 to 174, something like that. There are a lot of Republicans who are very unhappy with this budget. I am among those Republicans unhappy with this budget. I called it yesterday on the program a crap sandwich. That's because every omnibus is by definition a crap sandwich. It's why it's an omnibus. The whole purpose of an omnibus is to put a bunch of stuff you like in there with a bunch of stuff you don't, and then say to folks, if you don't vote for this bill, you're voting against all the good things, right? You're voting down all of the goodies. Yesterday, we went through how the bill doesn't cover anything for the border wall, essentially, how it doesn't do anything about DACA, how the bill continues to ensure that Planned Parenthood gets funded. It doesn't remove any of the Obamacare regulations. There's a bunch to really dislike about the bill. What's there to like about the bill is that there is a push in the bill for greater military funding, which, of course, is necessary after the Obama years in which we slashed our military pretty dramatically. So that is good. But now confusion is broken out. So there are a bunch of Republicans who, of course, were very upset about this. Ted Cruz was very upset about this. Mike Lee was very upset about it. Rand Paul was quite upset about it. The usual suspects in the Senate who you'd rely upon to be upset about a budget-busting $1.3 trillion bill. Those people were very upset about it, predictably enough. But they weren't able to stop it in the Senate, and it rolls through with 65 votes, a almost veto-proof majority. So Trump immediately comes out and says maybe he will veto it. What's weird about this, of course, is that that's not what he'd been saying a day before. So here's what he tweeted today, quote, I am considering a veto of the omnibus spending bill based on the fact that the 800,000 plus DACA recipients have not been totally abandoned by the Democrats, not even mentioned in bill. And the border wall, which is desperately needed for our national defense, is not fully funded. So a few things about this tweet. Number one, it's fascinating that he's saying that he wants to veto the omnibus spending bill based on the fact that DACA isn't taken care of, that DACA wasn't solved. So several times, I think 3 separate times, there was an attempt to make a deal during this bill negotiation with regard to DACA. And what the Trump administration offered was, and what Paul Ryan offered, was 3 years of continuation of DACA. People could still sign up as dreamers for DACA. 3 years of continuation of DACA, but not final status negotiations on the people who are actually here. It's not a pathway to citizenship for them. They just get to stay here for 3 more years for 3 years of wall funding. And the Democrats turned that one down flat. They instead suggested that they wanted full legalization of 1.8 million illegal immigrants. Well, Trump had already basically offered that, right? Like a few weeks ago, he offered $25 billion in wall funding plus end to chain migration and a few other goodies in exchange for legalizing 1.8 million dreamers. They weren't able to come to an agreement, and now Trump is saying the Democrats walked away from the table. There is some truth to that, but he has a Republican majority, so why isn't the border wall just being funded? Why isn't the border wall just being funded? If the border wall funding were in there, there's no question it passes the House, right? Trump's able to stump up enough support that he gets that through, and it's weird to me that Republicans aren't passing it. It's also weird to me that Trump is now threatening to veto, considering that 24 hours ago he was saying the reverse. Here's what Trump tweeted yesterday. Quote, "Got $1.6 billion to start wall on southern border. Rest will be forthcoming. Most importantly, got $700 billion to rebuild our military. $716 billion next year. Most ever. Had to waste money on dumb giveaways in order to take care of military pay increase and new equipment." A couple things. One, military pay increase already went into effect, I think, a couple months ago. But beyond that, this is a very pro-omnibus package tweet. Right? This is Trump saying, I like the omnibus package. We even got a little bit of wall funding. Well, number one, Mexico ain't paying for the wall, gang. And this is going to be up to Trump and the Republicans to do it. But it's fascinating to see how Trump flipped on this, on his own bill, right, within 24 hours. Literally yesterday, Mick Mulvaney, his head of Office of Management and Budget, he came out and he said, listen, Trump isn't going to veto this. We may not like the bill very much, but Trump isn't going to veto it. So here's what Mulvaney had to say. Oh, sorry. So Mulvaney came out during a briefing and he said that, he said that we need to shift the process in the Senate because these omnibus packages have to stop. We need to lower the funding boundary for the Senate. It can't be 60 votes in order to get these bills through. But he also said that this funds Trump's priorities, and we are not going to stand up against the bill. Now Trump, of course, has flipped. So it's a weird strategy, which suggests it's not strategic. Why is it a weird strategy? Because if you were going to threaten to veto something, wouldn't you do it before the Republicans vote for it? So you get your entire party on record voting for a bill you then threaten to veto. What? Like, how is that even logical? How does that make any sort of political sense? Now, if Trump actually did veto it, it would be a sign that maybe Trump actually wants to get involved in the policymaking process, but it also means that it's very difficult for anybody to know what he's going to do. Trump always says that he wants to be unpredictable with regard to his enemies. Well, you can't be unpredictable with regard to your allies. Put aside the fact that he's right that the bill's bad. The question is, why didn't he say this a week ago? Why didn't 3 days ago he go to Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and say, listen, I don't like this bill. I'm going to veto it if you pass it. So make some changes. Why didn't he throw his weight on the side of the House Freedom Caucus? And how is it helpful for him to jump in late when opinion turns against the bill and then take the legs out from underneath his own party? If you're Paul Ryan, you're Mitch McConnell, and you're sitting around going, listen, we went to the White House. We updated them every step on this negotiation, and they said fine, and now they're killing us? Hey, how do you trust the president to have your back if the president doesn't have your back? It is a serious problem for Republicans in Congress. Now, again, that's a separate issue from whether Trump is right about the bill. The bill sucks. He's right today. He was wrong yesterday. The bill is not good. The bill should not have passed. The bill should have been pared down. Republicans need to do better. And this is what the Freedom Caucus is there for in the House. They do a great job trying to push back against some of these spending priorities and then hopefully get a few concessions on the way. One other note about the budget before we move on. Everybody's always worried about the amount of spending in the budget. Oh, $1.3 trillion and $150 billion increase in non-defense discretionary spending and all the rest. That is not what's bankrupting the country. Okay, the non-defense discretionary spending is bad. I hate it. It's my tax dollars, and I am paying an awful lot of money to the federal government in taxes. But that is not actually what is creating our deficits. What is creating our deficits are Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. Those are the things that are driving our deficits. These structural entitlement programs we are spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year on, trillions of dollars. It's literally 2/3 of the federal budget. That stuff is not even discretionary, right? That's written into law. It's mandatory spending. When there's a government shutdown, people still get their Social Security checks. So that's what needs to be restructured. So, if it were the case that we're trading this omnibus package in favor of an entitlement reform, like Paul Ryan says, listen, I just want entitlement reform. We'll pass this budget so we don't have to spend our political capital here, but entitlement reform's next on the docket. I'd make that trade in a heartbeat. That is not the trade that's being made. The reason people are upset is because they feel like Republicans promised for years and years and years that they care about the spending, and it's pretty obvious that Republicans do not, in fact, care deeply about the spending. Okay, so in other big administration news, the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, is out. This had been rumored for legitimately half a year. One of the things that was really funny is that last week Trump tweeted out that H.R. McMaster was completely secure in his job. He also tweeted out that one of his lawyers, a guy named John Dowd, was completely secure in his job, and then that guy left. The media had reported both of them were on the outs. Trump, of course, says fake news. It turns out that was not fake news, because when Trump says fake news, it's only fake news like 40% of the time. Well, the guy who's replacing H.R. McMaster was sort of a foreign policy establishment guy. He's somebody who believed in sort of realpolitik balance of power. He tended to be relatively kind of weirdly interventionist in certain areas and non-interventionist in other. He had kind of a squishy view of the Iran deal. John Bolton's views are extraordinarily clear. John Bolton is the person who I'd wanted for Secretary of State. I think he'd be better in that role than as NSA, but I'm happy to have him inside the administration. Bolton, of course, was ambassador to the UN under George W. Bush. He is not a neocon. People have said that he's a neocon. He is not. To define neocon, there are really two definitions of neocon. Definition number one is the historical definition, which is somebody who was a lefty during the 1960s and then realized the errors of their ways. They were, in the popular phrase, mugged by reality and became more conservative. It was a specific movement of very heavily Jewish people in the 1960s, like Irving Kristol and Daniel Bell, who's not Jewish, but was a member of these. These were the neocons in the 1970s, the people who had shifted over to the other side. Bolton was always a conservative. So by that definition, he's not a neocon. The other definition that's used is about people like Paul Wolfowitz, who are very into nation building, the idea that we're supposed to go into Iraq, knock over Saddam, and then stay there and build up the nation. That was actually not something that Bolton suggested doing. He said we had to get rid of Saddam because Saddam was funding terrorism and pursuing weapons of mass destruction, according to every intelligence agency on earth. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have turned the country back over to the Iraqis as soon as humanly possible, instead of sticking around and pouring hundreds of thousands of more troops in there. So he's been called a nation-building neocon for a while, and that's not true. He wasn't in favor of the Arab Spring, for example. He is not averse to leaving American allies who happen to be dictators in power. He was in favor of leaving Hosni Mubarak in power in Egypt. So he is not a democracy-first neocon in that sense. So people are mischaracterizing the situation. Democrats, of course, are going nuts over this. Chris Matthews, oh, no, they say that John Bolton, look at that mustache. Look at John Bolton. I get over here, rumple my hair, suits all wrinkled. I just roll in here and I do a show. John Bolton, that guy even has a mustache, though. And I said to my wife, Kathleen, you even like mustache? She said, no. MSNBC Hardball, go.
John Bolton, Mr. Hawk, because he promised the working men and women of those states that voted for him, the gritty factory workers and other people who didn't like these wars because their kids do all the fighting and getting killed and losing their legs and everything else. He said to them, no more stupid wars. Now he brings in the godfather of stupid wars, John Bolton. Anyway, the congressman has been with us. Thank you so much, Eric Swalwell of California.
He's the godfather of stupid wars, John Bolton. It was John Bolton's fault. John Bolton was like Undersecretary of State for Near East Affairs or something like at the time. So, again, the idea that John Bolton was the architect of the Iraq War is just not true. It is not true. He was in favor of a broader Syrian intervention. I want to go through John Bolton's record a little bit. And in a minute, I'm going to go through his record in rather fulsome fashion. We'll discuss what his actual views are and how they will impact the administration, whether we should be worried about him. But first, what exactly is John Bolton's actual record? So here's an editorial that he wrote in 2012 about the situation in Syria. What he said was, as hostilities in Syria roll on unabated, the civilian casualties rise because of combat operations in urban areas and execution-style killings. In response, calls for U.S. military intervention of one sort or another continue to aid the opposition increase, while the Obama administration dithers over whether to continue relying on the UN Security Council and former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. But what are America's interests at stake, and what is the best way to protect them? Although it is easy to concentrate on the stomach-churning television images, we should operate on the basis of strategy, not emotion. That doesn't mean doing nothing, but neither does it mean knee-jerk reactions instead of careful analysis. He says that regime change in Syria is prima facie in America's best interest, as well as the interests of Israel and our Arab friends in the region, who see nothing but danger for themselves if Iran's hegemonic ambitions unfold successfully. He says there's no reason to coddle Assad. He says that we should have supported the Syrian opposition. He says the possibility of getting rid of Assad is now more remote, given the widespread infiltration of the anti-Assad forces by al-Qaeda and other terrorists. In truth, we don't know enough about the opposition's political or military leadership to predict who would prevail in the immediate aftermath of Assad's overthrow. This is John Bolton writing about Syria in 2012. In such circumstances, the risk of a radical Islamist replacing Assad is considerably higher than it would have been if we had moved to oust him years ago. A relatively orderly exit by Assad is one thing. A disorderly, indeed chaotic exit is quite another, especially given the risk that Syria's chemical and biological weapons assets, and maybe even nuclear assets, might fall into the hands of people even worse than Assad. And then he talks about the humanitarian considerations, and he says without substantial on-the-ground troop presence, we cannot prevent all of that brutality and evil. So he sort of evaluates the whole situation, and he says his bottom line is Obama's not up to the job in Syria. The gravest risk of American involvement is that his administration and Iran might find common ground in the Middle East chess game. Iran would allow Assad to fall, losing its pawn, and in exchange, Obama would agree to do even less than he's doing now to stop Iran's nuclear weapons program. So he says we should cut Syria off from its major supporters. Here's his actual program. Cut Syria off from its major supporters. Russia should be told in no uncertain terms it can forget about sustained good relations with the United States as long as it continues to back Assad. We should resume full-scale, indeed accelerated efforts to construct limited missile defense systems designed by George W. Bush to protect America's territory against Russia and other rogue states. He says we should announce our withdrawal from the New START arms control treaty. And then we should tell Iran that our patience with their decade-long ploy of using diplomacy to gain time to advance their nuclear weapons program has ended. Tehran should face a stark choice, and we can leave to their imagination what will happen if they fail immediately to dismantle all aspects of their existing nuclear effort. And we should also reverse the fantasy that despite its repeated violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that Iran is entitled to a peaceful nuclear program. And then he says, finally, in Syria itself, we should do now what we have begun to do 10 years ago. Find Syrian rebel leaders who are truly secular and who oppose radical Islam, who will disavow al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups, and who will reject Russian and Iranian hegemony over their country. We'll need some reason to believe the opposition can prevail against Assad. So this is not a guy who's saying, let's go in and knock over Assad willy-nilly, right? This is a guy who's actually taking into account the situation on the ground in Syria and taking a pretty anti-Russian perspective, right? For all the people on the left who are claiming that Trump is enthralled to the Russians, John Bolton certainly is not enthralled to the Russians. In fact, I have the evidence that John Bolton is not enthralled to the Russians. Here's what John Bolton had to say about Russian sanctions just a few months ago. This is in December 2016.
The Russians have walked all over the Obama administration for 8 years. It's really been a pathetic performance. So what this last burst of activity has to do is hard to say. I do think it's intended to try and box the Trump administration in. I think it will fail. This is simply an executive order. If President Trump decides to reverse it, it's easy enough to do. If you make them feel pain and others feel pain, then the possibility of deterring future conduct like this increases. That's what we need to do.
Okay, so obviously John Bolton is not a pansy for Russia, right? And this is a guy who's very, very harsh on Russia. He's also very harsh on Iran. He's very harsh on Syria. Now, people have said that he's a warmonger. What's hilarious about this is that he's been in favor of a lot of the same wars Democrats were in favor of, right? Libya was actually Hillary Clinton's war. Now, what Bolton said about Libya is that we should oust Gaddafi. I think that he was wrong about that, right? He had said this back in 2011, I believe, that we should kill Muammar Gaddafi. It was in March 2011. He said that there was a risk of a terrorist takeover. He says one of the things the administration should be doing is identifying pro-American, pro-Western leaders in the opposition and assisting them. I don't see any evidence they're doing that now. But this is a rare case of a Gaddafi on the one hand, the unknown on the other. I'd pick the unknown. Obviously, that was wrong. You shouldn't pick the unknown. You should pick what you know, unfortunately. But, you know, the idea that Bolton is some sort of wild cowboy who's out there stumping for war in all cases is not correct. Here's what Bolton had to say about the Iran deal. So Trump's entire national security team now, right? He's got Mike Pompeo over at State, and he's got Bolton as NSA. All of them are anti-Iran deal, which is a good thing because the Iran deal is a debacle and a disaster. Here's Bolton just a few years ago talking about the stupidity and evils of the Iran deal.
But let's be clear what America's interest is. This deal was a strategic debacle. Not only is it bad for the United States in the big picture, the terms of the deal are bad. You can't hold them to the terms of a deal that are as amorphous and unclear and subject to multiple interpretations as this deal is. I think the only thing that we can do to try and get back on the right track is to say the deal's over. I am confident Iran was violating it before the ink was dry. They're doing it still today. And, you know, unless you're content to have Iran on an unimpeded path to deliverable nuclear weapons, this deal has to be scrapped.
Okay, so there's no question that he's a hawk, but he's also not a neocon in the sense of nation building. Bolton has defended the war in Iraq. Here's what he said years ago, I believe it's 2009, talking about the war in Iraq and why it was justified.
Were we right to go to war?
I don't think there's any question that the decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein was the correct decision. I think you have to look at what happened in Iraq through the prism of two separate questions. Was the initial decision correct? And was what happened subsequently the way we wanted it to be? The answer to the first question, to me, despite the events of the 6 years after the invasion, is still unquestionably yes. The regime itself, Saddam Hussein, his Ba'ath Party, were threats to peace and security in the region and the larger world.
Okay, so a lot of people on the left are very upset about that because it's become conventional wisdom to say that the Iraq War was wrong. Based on the evidence that we had at the time, the Iraq War was not wrong. The pursuit of how we did the Iraq War was wrong, and members of the Bush administration have acknowledged as much. Again, you can only go to war based on the evidence that you have in front of you. Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, John Kerry, every Democrat, Nancy Pelosi, all of them supported the Iraq War because the evidence that was put in front of them was very different from the evidence that was later gathered. Now, the real reason that people are upset about Bolton in the NSA position is because they're afraid that he's such a hawk. He'll go to Trump, he'll talk a bunch of hawkery into Trump's ear, and suddenly we'll be at war. And the reason that they're saying this is because Bolton has been particularly harsh on North Korea. So he just wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal in February 28th, 2018, so not even a month ago, in which he talked about the legal case for striking North Korea first.
We are going to Washington, D.C., and we are going to drain the swamp. Let's swamp them. When we win tomorrow, we are going to drain the swamp.
The president said that again and again in the campaign. Now that he's made it to Washington, not quite working out that way all the time.
Well, it's tough. The swamp is deep and thick. We're going to bring in Dan Bongino, former NYPD officer, former Secret Service agent, and host of the Dan Bongino Show. First of all, Dan, your take. I mean, listen, he's been fighting the swamp. The swamp delivers him a budget. He wants to veto it. He doesn't. He's supporting the military. What's your take?
You know, Pete, listen, I was disappointed yesterday. I support this president. I think he's done some tremendous things. The tax cuts, the move towards deregulation and cutting government red tape. Those have been really tremendous moves, especially for a first-year presidency. But I think we have to be candid. Yesterday was a disaster. There was a golden opportunity at that press conference to take that bill, walk up to that podium, Pete, throw it up in the air and say, you're all fired, I'm vetoing this damn thing, and you better get back to the drawing board. I mean, it would have been an epic move that would have just, the grassroots would have went wild with elation. And, you know, he signed it, which, you know, I hope he's true to his word, though, and he says this is the last time.
But Dan, his Achilles heel is the DOD, is the military, is the troops. He wants them funded, and you got to understand that as well.
No, of course. Listen, it was obviously we need to rebuild our military. It is not. We're shuttering. Our equipment is falling apart. I get it. I understand that, and I understand his loyalty to our warfighters, Pete. But you know, we're going bankrupt, and a military is not going to matter if we have no money in the future. This is the most predictable financial crisis in human history. And one more thing. I'm sorry, I don't mean to drone on this, but. Shame on Congress and the Senate, too. Let's not just put the blame on Trump here. He was put in a box by them. What about Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and these others? I mean, can they not do simple math? Guys, there's no money. There is no money left. Yeah. Stop spending money we don't have. There's none left.
Well, Dan,
it's pathetic.
You're angry. I think you speak for so many Americans today that are frustrated with the process, but are frustrated with the spending. It is out of control. All right, well, let's bring in Michelle Malkin, of course, host of the Michelle Malkin Investigates on CRTV. Michelle, always good to see you.
Great to see you too, Abby. I want to just give you my congratulations as well. It's great to see your face back on the channel, but I will tell you that there is no more rewarding, satisfying, and challenging job that you will ever have than as motherhood. And I will tell you, as a mom of a 17-year-old now who's going to be graduating from high school, it is an incredible journey. So congrats.
It means the world coming for you. And I will say, it makes you more passionate about issues that are going on in this country. You're thinking about your own kids now, so I understand that, and I now get why you're so passionate about things you believe in. And I want you to talk about one of those sanctuary cities. The movement seems to be spreading. Huntington Beach in California might follow Los Alamitos suit in challenging California's sanctuary city law. Where do you see this going? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that among many responsible law enforcement officials, police chiefs, and mayors of cities and counties in California that do not agree with the hijacking of that state by open border zealots, that they have a responsibility and they realize it. They all took oaths of office to uphold the Constitution and the laws of this country. And so I think, in essence, the anti-sanctuary movement that we're now seeing, that was spurred on by the lawsuit by the DOJ and the position of our president very strongly opposing the basically the abdication of responsibility by California officials, I think that this movement constitutes a real effort by some of these responsible leaders to make California sane again. Now, whether it's too late, I think, is the question. But remember that we're talking about three pieces of legislation that have undermined the safety of Californians and by extension the rest of us. The first one dealing with undermining worksite enforcement by private employers, which is outrageous. The second one dealing with detention and the inability to share information among local and state officials with federal ICE agents, which, as we know, this channel has reported time and time again about the bloody consequences of sanctuary policies. And the third one having to do with the actual release dates of so-called removable aliens and being able to give that information to the feds so that they can pick people up before they're released. And, of course, I have reported many times over the years about these catch and release policies that have had deadly effects.
Well said, Michelle. Well, while we're on the topic of California and insanity, I've got to get your take on this topic. Parents are outraged there after Planned Parenthood got invited to a middle school mental health fair, presumably to provide information. Talk to us about the mindset of a school that would say Planned Parenthood and what they provide is welcome at a middle school.
So, yes, this is Clifton Middle School in Monrovia, California. And apparently the superintendent has reported to parents that that they didn't know. The school district didn't know that Planned Parenthood was going to show up. And I think that the bottom line here, of course, is that the lack of transparency and disclosure is an outrage. And the idea of Planned Parenthood showing up at a science fair when they lie all the time about what they actually do within the walls of their clinics. Will there also be equal time for crisis pregnancy centers to share information about, for example, the science of ultrasound and what actually is happening in the development of unborn life? You've got a death lobby that is funded by federal tax dollars. You want to blame someone? How about this Omnibus bill that gives $500 million to subsidize Planned Parenthood's activities and Title X grants as well? I think that a lot of the ire should be directed at Congress as much as the local school district in this case.
Yeah, Michelle, on that point, are you disappointed the president signed the omnibus when there's the funding you talk about, federal funding for Planned Parenthood, as well as, by the way, the bill does not cut off funding for sanctuary cities as promised?
That's exactly right. I'm beyond disappointed. I'm disgusted. I'm disgusted with the so-called GOP leadership. This falls squarely on the shoulders of Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell. It is business as usual. People need to open up their eyes about how these appropriations bills and every piece of legislation that passes ram down our throats without any consideration of transparency and true deliberation by so-called deliberative bodies.
Yeah. Well, your anger speaks for a lot of American people waking up this morning. Michelle.
Sounds like we should send you to Capitol Hill. You might want to, I wouldn't want to be in a meeting with you and Speaker Ryan.
I think a lot of people would vote for Michelle Malkin. That's true. Michelle, thanks for joining us this morning.
Yes, I would drain the swamp. Thanks. Take care.
With her bare hands.
Yeah.
The House of Representatives passed a massive $1.3 trillion spending bill today intended to prevent a government shutdown. The Senate will likely follow suit. It's being shepherded by Republicans, but you would be forgiven for not knowing that. The bill caps ICE agents we can hire and the number of illegal aliens ICE can detain. A border wall is out of the picture. It gives hundreds of millions to Planned Parenthood. It funds sanctuary cities. It ups the EPA's budget by more than $750 million. It's not something Republicans said they were for. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky joins us now. Senator, we asked over a dozen Republicans who voted for this to come on. None would do it. The people who wrote this, were they here for the 2016 election?
You know, I'm kind of old school. I think you ought to read the bills, before we vote on them. This is a 2,200-page bill. We got it last night at midnight. I've been working all day diligently through the bill, and I'm up to page 600. But, I've still got quite a bit of ways to go to read the bill. As far as the content of the bill, this could have been written by President Obama and liberal Democrats. When I ran in 2010, when we had that Tea Party tidal wave, we were opposed to President Obama's spending, and we were opposed to President Obama's trillion-dollar deficits. This bill will give us a trillion-dollar deficit this year.
Paul Ryan is, of course, ultimately responsible for this as the head Republican in the House. I mean, these are his priorities, I assume, but they're so out of whack with the priorities of the party. How?
I think this is why people are so upset with politics, because when the Republicans are out of power, when they're in the minority, they are the conservative party. But then when they get in the majority, there is no conservative party. Democrats don't care about spending any of the time. Republicans seem to care about it when they're criticizing Democrats. But now that Republicans are in charge, Republicans are like, Katie, bar the door. You talked about border security. I'm flipping through the pages today reading the bill. I find out there is money for border security in Tunisia, in Jordan. We have border security money in the Middle East, but not border security money for the U.S.
So I'm just concluding that the people who run the Republican Party in the House anyway just don't want increased border security.
No, what it is this. It's an unholy alliance. The unholy alliance between Republicans and Democrats is this. Republicans are not fiscally conservative on the military. They want unlimited spending on the military.
Right.
Democrats say, we'll give it to you. We're not really opposed to it. We'll give you the military spending if you give us the domestic spending. So really the unholy alliance, the unholy compromise has been going on for decades is we really actually have too much compromise in Washington. They're always compromising to raise spending and increase the debt.
Really quick, are you going to stop this? You're going to shut down the government over this?
It's never been my goal to shut down government, but my goal is to say that we should be for balanced budgets, limited spending, less debt, and we should be for reading the bills. So I'll continue to advocate that. Whether they can roll over me, I'm in the minority. There'll be about 10 Republicans that vote, maybe 15 Republicans vote no on this in the Senate, maybe a handful of Democrats. Yeah. But they will win. The majority will win. But it's Republicans and Democrats joining hands together to blow a hole in the debt.
I know you're going back up the hill. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, Senator.
At President Trump arriving in West Palm Beach, Florida this evening to spend the weekend at his weekend place in Mar-a-Lago. Been quite a day for the president. Tonight, he vowed never again, reluctantly signing a $1.3 trillion budget bill. Watch this.
There are a lot of things that I'm unhappy about in this bill. But I say to Congress, I will never sign another bill like this again. I'm not going to do it again. Nobody read it. It's only hours old. Some people don't even know what it is. $1.3 trillion. It's the second largest ever.
Nobody read it. Don't you love that part? But a number of Republicans are questioning exactly what the GOP got out of this deal and whether Mr. Trump, as some have said today, got rolled by the Democrats.
This is Ann Coulter reacting, Jennifer. She tweeted out, "Congratulations, President Schumer," essentially saying that the president got played here. "I will never sign another bill like this again." She's quoting from the president. "Yeah, because you'll be impeached."
This president promised to drain the swamp. He's a jobs program for the swamp. He says he's going to drain the swamp, but he's the best thing that's ever happened to the swamp.
The Democrats really got most of what they wanted in this bill. Democrats weren't necessarily opposed to more defense spending. They just didn't want to give defense spending until they got a lot on domestic spending, and they got most of what they wanted.
They sure did. Joining me now, Corey Lewandowski, former Trump campaign manager and chief strategist at America First Action. Corey, good to see you tonight. President's getting a lot of criticism on this from his base and from his supporters who believe that basically the Democrats did get everything they wanted in this very fat bill and that there's no fiscal responsibility happening on his watch at this point.
You know, what the president said today when he signed that bill was he was very disappointed in what the bill had in total. But there were some key components of this legislation that are important, and let me just highlight a few of them. $650 billion for the military. That will allow our men and women in uniform to get the first pay raise they've had, the largest pay raise they've had in over a decade. You know, we're talking about 24 new Navy ships. We're at the smallest Navy we've had in a lifetime. We're talking about 90 new aircrafts, new F-35s. We're talking about opportunities to rebuild our military so we can continue to be the world's greatest superpower. But in addition to the military, this bill funded $6 billion to fight the devastating opiate crisis, which is wreaking havoc across our country. We need to get this under control. Is this a perfect bill? Absolutely not. Did the president say it was a bill for national security? It is a bill for national security.
No,
but I was very concerned about the amount of spending
I got to jump in because, as you know, last night he sort of stunned, I think, a lot of people at the White House by coming out and saying he was going to veto the bill. Then this morning there was this whole scramble. He's going to do a news conference. Then he wasn't going to do a news conference. Then they moved the reporters from the press room over to the diplomatic receiving room, and he gave, a straightforward speech. I think that there's a feeling that he didn't do what he wanted to do here. Initially, his gut was telling him that he should veto this bill. He had a lot of his supporters who wanted him to do that. So the question tonight is what happened?
I think you might be right. I think his gut was telling him that this was a bad piece of legislation. Many of the things that are in this bill, he campaigned against. And what we've seen once again, it's amazing. You know what Congress did? They went home again. The government's about to shut down. They put one piece of legislation from the president. They say, we put a gun to your head. You're going to sign this or we're going to close the government. It's going to be your fault. Why haven't we been able to keep the government open for a multi-year period? This is astonishing to me.
Yeah, but Corey, what about those people who say you've got Republicans in the House, Republicans in the Senate, Republicans in the White House? We thought this was going to be a fiscally responsible White House and administration, and they're wondering what the heck is happening.
Well, look, I don't disagree with you. I think 85 or 86 members of the Republican Party voted against this bill, and they get a pass with 111 Democrats voting for it because the Democrats do what the Democrats do. They know how to spend money. Look, the next generation, our kids, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren are saddled now with potentially $22 trillion in debt. It's unsustainable. This can never happen again.
Well, that's what the president said, and I thought, I think a lot of people thought he hit it on the head when he looked at that thing and said, they just finished this bill hours ago. Nobody's read it, and we're at the deadline. And this is the way we do things. I think people look at that across the country and say, are you kidding me? That, this is such an inefficient way to do things. Corey, as you're talking, we're watching the president walk down the steps of Air Force One. Looks like a beautiful night in Palm Beach as he begins this weekend. So you have a good weekend, too. Okay? Thanks for being here.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Thank you. So one group that was especially unhappy with this budget is veterans. They saw new health care provisions allowing them to choose their own doctor stripped because the bill just hours before it passed the House, that part came out. Pete Hegseth, U.S. Army combat veteran, co-host of Fox and Friends Weekend, and spends a huge amount of his life and his time supporting the veterans of this country. So what happened?
Well, what happened was the swamp happened. I hate to say it that way, but first of all, on the larger deal, the president's Achilles heel is the military. He wants to fund the military. He saw what happened under Obama and the decimation of sequestration. That's why he voted. That's why he supported this bill, even though a lot of us hoped he might veto it. Ultimately, at the VA, you had included in the bill was an opportunity for vets to choose their own, a doctor or the VA, a private option, which the president promised. At the last minute, Representative Tim Walz, he's running for governor in Minnesota, he's a Democrat, and Nancy Pelosi conspired to pull it out of the bill and instead increase more funding at the VA, which we've seen time and time again. So you add more money to the VA.
They took away the choice.
They took away the actual reforms that would give veterans real choice. And instead they said, let's add more funding. And they hoodwinked a lot of people at the last minute to do so. So, again, it's how the swamp works. At the last minute to make a deal, Democrats, to get their votes, to get more money, said we're going to take out the real reforms that would have advanced the president's agenda in exchange for more money. And then Democrats will say, we help the vets. They're not helping the vets. And the president's heart is in the right place, but he's signing this bill because he supports the troops, and the vets are in a tough spot.
Here's the political question, which is what Ann Coulter was talking about when she said, congratulations, President Schumer. And, here comes impeachment. Because the fear is that this alienates the people that support him and have supported the people who, they believe are going to vote like him.
Sure.
And that you're going to end up with people who are in the middle deciding that Democrats are a better choice for them, like we saw in Pennsylvania with the Connor Lamb election. And, he's going to lose his majority, which hasn't, has worked well in some ways and not so well in others anyway.
I feel like today may have been the day that the party of fiscal responsibility in the GOP died. I mean, there isn't real commitment to that today at all. If you're not committed to fiscal responsibility, then at least be committed to reform. And from the VA and across the board, you saw them give away the farm in exchange for defense spending, which I'm supportive of. I understand why His heart is in the right place, but he lost on so many other places because members of Congress, whether it's Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan, don't want to fight the fight and bring it to the brink. And that's why a veto could have done that. I understand why he did what he did, but we gave away a lot, and you're going to have to fight to take a lot of that terrain back.
Yeah, I mean, they got so burned shutting down the government.
If Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer love it,
they're terrified to go ahead and to push that button again.
But they won the last one, Martha. The last shutdown was won. Chuck Schumer knew and then they've got the item of DACA and the wall. I think it's a fight he can win, but I understand where he's at.
Thank you, Pete.
Thanks,
Good to
Martha.
see you at night.
Appreciate
Thanks for coming in.
We'll see you in the morning.
All right.
Sure.
Coming up next, the real story behind the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal. Why it may not be the bombshell on corrupt campaigns that seems to be reported out there. My next guest knows firsthand how these things work. Former director of research and analytics for the Cruz campaign. He says it's not what it appears to be.